How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. While looking for North American wildlife at Walmart the other day, I found this. And you may be saying, that's not North American wildlife, that's the gorilla from King Kong. And you're right, but it was on clearance, and I knew that with a little creativity, I could figure out how to work it into the wild imaginary West. I broke out some nippers, and after releasing Mighty Joe Young from his bonds, it was time to figure out what to do with him. I knew I didn't want him to remain a run-of-the-mill giant ape, so I removed his head, and I'll be swapping that out with something else in a minute. I'll save these leftover heads, just in case I ever need them. As for right now, let's figure out what to do with his new head. I knew I wanted something a little more monster-like for the new head, so I grabbed this mink skull off of Thingiverse from Doc Copamus, and I printed it out in resin. I'll leave a link to that file in the description. After that, it was time to start sculpting, but I threw on some gloves first because I will be handling epoxy and you don't want that stuff getting on your skin. For the sculpting, I'm going to be using some Milliput, which is a 2-part epoxy putty. After you mix the 2 parts together, you can sculpt with it like clay, and then after about 4 hours it cures as hard as a rock, which makes it a great alternative to clay if you don't want to put your gorilla in the oven. I mixed the 2 parts and I joined the mandible to the cranium and fixed them in an open mouth position. I also filled in where the eyes of the mink would have been because I have another animal in mind for this monster, and it's not a weasel. Before joining the head with the body, I trimmed down the neck so that the proportions would be correct when I turned this thing into a terrifying sloth. You may be thinking to yourself, sloths aren't scary. Sloths are the adorable and lethargic animals living in treetops. And that's true, but that's not the sloth that I'm thinking of. The sloth that I had in mind is the giant ground sloth, which is a far larger and scarier relative of the cute guys that hang from the trees. Unfortunately, they are extinct now. While they may not be the most ferocious looking animals out there, I certainly wouldn't want to run into one after dark. I mixed up a bunch more Milliput and began filling in the holes in the gorilla that make it look like an action figure. I rolled the Milliput into little snakes and I wrapped them around the joints wherever there was a gap. I did the same thing with a little more volume behind the head. I then used some sculpting tools to blend the putty into the fur texture, and I added some long droopy hair on the sides of the head as well as the tongue inside the mouth. And it was at this point that I realized I had recreated one of those monsters from the mobile game Temple Run. But unlike them, this guy moves really slow. I left all that Milliput to cure for a couple hours and I began working on the base. I started with a gesso board. As the foundation, I used some XPS insulation foam to build up the layers of the terrain. I trimmed down the foam to the correct size using a nice sharp utility knife, which I used to carve the shape of the slope as well. I also made a little cliff face that will be the top layer of this foam cake. I gave it some nice horizontal rock-like texture. Once I was happy with the shape of everything, I glued all the layers together with some foam-safe superglue. I also gave the surface a bit more natural variation using a butane torch. It's important to have proper ventilation and a fan running whenever you create fumes like this. I tested the pose of the sloth against the hillside, and after that, it was time to add a terrain paste. I mixed up some Mod Podge, plaster, and paper mache mix with a splash of water, and once I had reached the consistency of the paste that I was hoping for, I spread it across the surface, leaving just the little cliff face exposed. The mix acts just like sculpt mold and creates a really nice earthy texture. Once the paste had set for a bit, I impressed the prints of the sloth, and then I covered the remaining pink surfaces with plaster, paint, and Mod Podge. The consistency of this mix is much thinner and preserves all the detail that I carved into the foam. Once the terrain pastes had had some time to dry, I brought the base back to give it some additional texture. I painted on some Mod Podge in a few areas and sprinkled on some pebbles. I followed that up with some sand and flocking, and then I sealed it all together with watered down white glue and isopropyl alcohol. I then set that aside one more time to dry, and it was time to prime the sloth. I took our little friend here outside, gave him a zenithal highlight, and then it was time to begin painting. The color inspiration for this sloth is a sloth, and comparing these side by side, I actually can't see much of a difference. I started with a nice warm earthy base coat, and I followed that up with a light greenish tan. A rolling stone gathers no moss, but the same can't be said for sloths, hence the green. I then dry brushed on a slightly lighter color of tan to bring out those hairs, and I darkened the area around the sloth's head and shoulders. I gave the sloth one final dry brushing to get those highlights back, and then I painted the bony face with that classic slothy darkness around the eyes. He may be a bit scary. There's also something kind of cute and innocent about him as well. Like all of the monsters in this universe, he's just an animal after all. At this point, the base was fully dried, so it was time to prime that as well. It takes years of crafting to figure out how to do that. Before painting the base, I prepped these two minis for the human and horse element of this diorama. I gave the horse a little forestall and antenna, and I primed them both off camera. The base got a bunch of earthy washes splotched on semi-randomly, and then I followed that up with some live and dead plant color. The flocking went on pretty heavy, and I didn't want all of it, so I tapped off the excess and then I glued the rest down with watered down white glue and IPA. In case you're curious, the alcohol breaks down the surface tension of the glue, keeping it from beating up on the surface. I left the base to dry one final time, and it was time to paint the minis. I started with the horse, whose name is B. Siskett. The horse's demeanor is far more chill than you'd expect, being so close to such a large and scary creature. But the horse definitely knows the capability of the sloth. I can tell that it's just far too slow to catch it, even if it tried. Next, I painted the man, who flaunts a similar level of nonchalance as his horse. I decided to give this guy a yellow hat as an ode to the original ape body of the sloth. Just like his horse, this gentleman knows that the giant sloth is mostly a scavenger that eats large, dead, or wounded things, like its cousin the skunk ape, so he knows that as long as he keeps moving, he and his horse are in no danger. After the minis were painted, the base was dry, and it was ready for the assembly process. I removed the minis from the bases that they were molded onto using my God hand nippers. These things are pretty expensive, but they make excellent clean cuts. I'd recommend a pair if you do stuff like this very often. I glued the minis down to the base using some super glue, and then I glued them together with a little piece of string to act as a little lead. Next, I broke out a little box of miniature foliage that was sent to me as a gift by Diorama Persepe. They produce some amazing miniature foliage. I will drop a link to them in the description. Once the side of the hill had a realistic amount of vegetation on it, it was time to glue the monster in place. I used some styrene rods that fit perfectly into the holes in the action figure's feet, drilled some corresponding holes into the base, and then I fixed the monster into position. After that, I sprinkled some vegetation onto the big guy himself to help sell that sloth idea just a little better. The last thing to do was to clean up the sides of the diorama with some matte black. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.